And good morning, everyone. So first of all, a disclaimer. I'm not going to talk about AFB, mostly because I don't know anything about AFB, and you don't want to listen to me not knowing something about anything. So what I am going to talk about, though, picking up from the last speaker, is a bit about risk. And I'm going to talk about it in terms of brand risk rather than, I guess, health and safety risk or product risk and that sort of thing. Because when you think about the products that we're putting out into the market, there's actually not a lot that can really go wrong with them in terms of product safety. We've only got one real hazard that we deal with in our industry, certainly from a honey point of view, which is obviously tooting. Beyond that, really the biggest risk that I see is what does the consumer think? If you stuff it up, what does the consumer think, and what's the risk to your business? So when I'm talking about risk and products and so forth, it's really around what does the consumer think and all of that. So we have, there's a bunch of organisations around the world. There's governments and there's consumer watchdogs, there's consumer advocacy groups. They're out there testing products, they're out there looking for stuff, and it's a bit like Randy was commenting about before, you know, it's the bad stuff that sells. If I can sensationalise something, if I can find something bad, I can publicise that, I can probably make money, and I can create a whole lot of trouble for people that I want to create trouble for. So governments are sometimes doing this for the purpose of protecting their consumers, but also protecting their borders. And it's a great way to protect your domestic trade if you can find a reason to stop your product getting in. So what you have to think about here is, you know, everything you do, every chemical you use is probably going to leave a trace. It's going to leave evidence for someone else to find. So what do you want them to find in your product, or not find in your product? So what are they looking for? So there's three general areas that, and they're not all residues, but when you've got these guys out there looking at your products, our products, there's three areas in general. So there's the quality aspects, there's the adulteration ones, and the residues. And I'll talk more about the residues later. But the quality stuff is pretty much well established in your up and down the supply chain. So that's things like if we look at Manuka Health's poster here. So the things on the poster there, you're calling it Manuka honey. Well, is it Manuka honey? So, you know, if we have a look at what's in the honey, does it stack up? Does it look like it's Manuka honey? Is it from New Zealand? So they can look at things like the pollen composition and say, well, does that look like it comes from New Zealand, or is there something weird in it that looks like it comes from somewhere else? And things like the MGO 250 or your UMF rating or whatever you've got in there, is it actually true to label? Is it real? So we're used to dealing with all of that in the industry, up and down the supply chain. You get involved in all of that, you know where you stand, and I think that's pretty well managed. The adulteration side of it is mostly focused, well, a lot of the focus, other than if you're not true to label, or I guess floral origin, but one of the real big ones around that, of course, is sugar contamination. And again, this is consumer perception, because the problem is that internationally, honey is one of those products that's very subject to food fraud, and one of the biggest frauds is to add a whole lot of sugar to it deliberately. Now, no one in New Zealand does that, or if they do, they must be a very small minority, because I think we've probably got the most honest business. There's another interesting observation from Randy as well, is that this industry seems to be one of the most honest that. He made that comment about our regard to using chemicals and things, and I think the same with sugar. So the issue we have is that we do have problems with overfeeding, but you know, I think there's also some concerns about, is the testing right? Well, the testing is what it is. You should know where you stand with that, and I think there's more and more people understand where do they sit with their product with regard to that testing. There is some testing emerging, new testing. There's NMR, there's SMX. You know, do these methods work or not? Well, I think there's questions around whether they work effectively or not, but the issue remains that you are probably getting your product tested, and you know where you stand, you know what the risk is, and you're dealing with it. The big area that concerns me, I suppose, is the residues from the chemicals that we use, because they get a little bit overlooked, and I'm not really sure why, but I think there's less emphasis on that, and yet the perception with the consumer is probably the worst of any of them. So finding pesticides and herbicides and miticides and all these things in your product is probably the worst thing from a consumer point of view. So we don't generally have a big issue around well, we don't have an issue at all really around antibiotics, other than the occasional semicarbazide thing which pops up, and that's a relic from another problem. It's nothing to do with us actually using antibiotics. The herbicides, so this is one of the ones that concerns me, because we hear a lot about using herbicides that are safe for bees, and that's great. We don't want to harm the bees, but are the bees visiting something which has had herbicide on it, and where does the herbicide go? Does it go back into the hive? If it doesn't hurt the bee, that's fantastic, but is it in the product? And yes, it is. So you want to have a think about what you're using. Are you using it around the hives? Are you using it on things that are flowering, or are your landowners using it on things that are flowering? And what are the bees doing? Have you got agreements with your landowners around the use of chemicals, and are they going to notify you if they use them? What's in the area? So it's about really understanding that risk. And if you don't think it's there, have a look at some of the overseas publications around herbicide levels in honey. I don't think we've really come under the spotlight, but you go and have a look at what's overseas, and our practices, I don't think, are substantially different. So the one that and Tooten I mentioned before, I think that's pretty well controlled. PAs is an interesting one, so that's the pyrrolizidine alkaloids. Again, consumers don't really like the idea of plant toxins being in their honey, being in their food. The reality is that consumers consume plant toxins all the time, and they just don't know about it. There's a lot of conversation still happening with the regulators and the scientific experts about what is a safe level of these various PAs. We've got a project going in New Zealand to look at what is the impact on the honey industry from PAs in our own environment. I don't think there's any reason to be worried at this stage, but it's certainly something we need to look into a bit more. But yeah, at this stage I don't think there's any concern. But the miticides, so I'll go into that in a bit more detail, because I've got some interesting observations there. And the first thing I'll show you is this is an online portal that we have for our supply partners, which gives them the ability to see all of the test results for their drums. So they get to see things like the C4 sugar results and the miticide levels, and in particular amitraz, so we've got to focus on that. Now the interesting thing with that is that when we started doing this back in 2014-15, we hadn't started feeding results back to people back then. But if you look at that graph, you can see the Comvita results are the blue ones, and then the rest of the supply chain in terms of third-party supply, they're all the orange ones. So if you look at that's where the current New Zealand MRL is for amitraz. That's where the international limit for amitraz is. It's a bit disconcerting that there's about 200 tonnes of product which is actually in excess of the international limit for amitraz. And these suppliers had no idea. So what that also indicates is if you can use minimal amounts of amitraz, which the vast majority of the industry is, why are some people using so much that they're getting that much in their honey? And what's that doing to the acceleration of varroa resistance to amitraz? So there's a concern, I guess, within the data of what is it saying about good apicultural practice around using amitraz in the first place. So the next slide is 2016. So do you think it got better or worse? Worse? No, it actually got better. And the reason is because we're feeding that information back to those suppliers. So they're going, I never knew, so thanks for telling me. So things got better. So now we've got the vast majority of the results well under the 0.1 limit. Basically nothing above 0.2, and then 2017, basically there's nothing anywhere near 0.2, and just a smattering around the 0.1. So what that says is that if you're measuring it, you can manage it. If you're not measuring it, you're in the dark. You don't know what you've got. So another way of looking at that is over time, if you look at what's in excess of the current New Zealand limit of 0.1, we've gone from having our third-party supply being around 10% too high, or what's on offer, down to 2%, and that's still falling, so it's getting better all the time. So So that's been a really good success. So people knowing what they've got means they can modify their behaviour, they can manage things better. It means we're putting less miticides probably into the hive as well, which means that we're probably not accelerating the resistance of Varroa to Amitraz. And then the other development, the recent development, is that we are actually shifting the New Zealand MRL from point 1 to point 2, which is probably a good thing because then we're aligned internationally. But I guess the caution here is don't take that as license to go hard out and use Amitraz as much as you like, because at the end of the day, you're not selling your product, or we're not selling our product to regulators, we're selling it to consumers. And consumers don't like this stuff in their product. And I sort of look at it this way, that if we're going to get tested, if our product's going to get pulled off the shelf and tested, then some of the other people in this room, your product's going to get pulled off the shelf and tested. And I know which end of the list I'd like to be. I'd like to be at the end of the list that has the least amount. And if you've got the most amount, then that's a good place for me to hide. So that's really all I have to say about that. I think I've run out of time as well. I guess the final slide then is just, in all of that, just think about what you're adding to the hive. What residues could possibly be in your product, and what are you doing to manage that? And if someone finds it, how does that leave you and your brand looking and your business looking? So that's all from me. Thank you.